Hi, I'm James Tobin here in Charlottesville, Virginia, and that was the All Virginia Bass Clarinet Etude. And I think it's a nice little piece of music. There are several things that will help you play this well, and let's start at the beginning. So, the clarinet has notes that speak really easily and notes that don't speak so easily. Some notes are powerful and some are weak. And the first note we have here is plays really easily. It'll speak well with really good wind or with poor wind. What's really important is that you have the wind you need for the second note already prepared, because the B is a long pipe note. It takes a little bit more wind, and it's a little resistant on a bass clarinet. But what I'm getting at is I'm really thinking about so that I get a wonderful connection from the F sharp to the B, which we have to do several times in this piece. So if you really make sure that you're thinking of the wind you need for the B, the F sharp will take care of itself. Rhythmically, I like how they have printed the duplet eighth notes. Like in other All Virginia etudes, measures 21 and 22 would have had just simple eighth notes with a 2 underneath them, and I think that invites a lot of guessing sometimes. This is written perfectly. Each one of these is half of a beat, okay? If you just try to feel it, however, I think you're going to end up slowing down unintentionally. And so it's useful for you to subdivide this. I'm going to play from 20. If you can tongue that to make it a physical motion while you are preparing these measures, it will help. If you can think it, that will also be good. But if it's in your mind, then the rhythm will be exactly what it's supposed to be without any chance of it lagging. I think if you listen to my performance, I definitely put a little rallentando in there because it sounds good. But that's an intentional choice as opposed to an accidental playing of the rhythm wrong. The tenutos in this piece. Okay, so the tenuto lines, the dashes above the notes, they can mean 3 different things. The most obvious, it means tongue legato. And the reason why I'm not approaching them that way in this piece is because legato is kind of the default articulation for this, and there's very little staccato asked for in this piece. So I don't think the composer is communicating an articulative choice. The next thing would be to hold the note a little bit longer than its printed value. That's another use of the tenuto mark. I wouldn't do that here. I think that invites the judges to think that your rhythm is insecure. And additionally, when we go back to measures 21 and 22, if each one of these notes is going to be a little bit longer than its printed value, isn't that an effective ritornado? So I personally have chosen to go with the third option here, which is that a tenuto line can be employed to mean an almost accent. So not a full accent, more of a press than a full accent, and that's what I use throughout my performance just now. Obviously, that's up to you. You know, that's a aesthetic marker that needs to be interpreted by you to mean something. So maybe you do want to make sure that it's all of the tenutos are really legato, which I think would mean that you need to then play with a little bit of separation in lots of the other places. That's one of the reasons why I'm not certain that I personally would choose articulation as the way to interpret that marking. But it's open to interpretation. Accents. Of course, an accent is a burst of wind. It doesn't need to have any extra tonguing added to it. It really should just be the same as a cough or a laugh. It's something that's driven by your core muscles. And we have different types of accents in this piece. So for example, the accent in measure 3, you really honestly don't need to put too much on this because we're rising so quickly into the upper clarion. This note, it almost is accented even if you don't try to accent it. And it also zings out of the bass clarinet very easily for most horns. So I would not try to put too much accent on the accent in measure 3. Conversely, the accent in measure 6. This is a tricky one because it's in the middle of the clarion. It's a resistant note on most bass clarinets, so you really have to kind of make sure that you give it a good accent. And then underneath it, we have a crescendo. So essentially, you've got to accent the E, has to diminuendo, and then the rest of the measure has to crescendo. This is a pretty tricky use of wind. And it's something that you should practice. You know, it's also it's a note that has an accent and a tenuto on it. So, you know, good luck. I guess that means that it should be accented and very legato, because obviously the accent and the tenuto line in this case is not going to be, you can't fully accent a note and half accent it like I'm going to, how I'm going to use the other tenutos in this piece. So it's just something for you to consider and an opportunity for you to come up with something of your own. Let's see. Okay. I chose some breath marks that you might not choose. Basically, because the piece of music starts with a pickup note, I am always going to take a breath before a pickup note if a phrase begins with a pickup note. So for example, I think it's obvious in measure 4 that you are going to breathe after the long C sharp, and then the F sharp becomes a pickup note to an A sharp, right? Well, that also occurs in measure 8. That's pretty clear, right? When we get to measure 12, it's kind of not clear because the last two notes of the measure have, again, these tenuto marks on them. But I chose to be consistent with the phrase structure of the piece. So I took a breath after the E in measure 12, but before the F sharp, so that the F sharp sounds like a clear pickup note to measure 13. A place in which I warred with myself about how I wanted to phrase it was measure 16, because I can hear this as the phrase ending on the B, which is large beat 3, which means you would then take a breath before the A dotted quarter note and make the A dotted quarter note sound like the beginning of the next section. But because there's a rallentando through the end of measure 16, I ended up deciding that I would take the breath after the A. By taking the breath after the A, I make the A the last note of the previous phrase, and then the new section starts right on the downbeat of measure 17, okay? Which makes sense because then it helps contrast to the A section because it doesn't have a pickup. You'll have to decide what you want to do, but this is what I did in my little performance. So you'll have decisions to make about how you think you wish to breathe to help show the phrase structure of the piece as you perform it. Let's see. Fingerings. All right, so I think the fingerings in this piece are straightforward. There's really in the first week of working on this, you should have made your decisions about which lefts and which rights you're going to use for B's and C sharps, and you should write all that stuff in because you don't want to think about it. Once you make a decision, unless you have a reason to, stick with the decision that you made. In a lot of these arpeggios, for example, in 7 or other places, I am definitely going to use the right C sharp. It fits in the fingers so nicely. I could do it with the left, but then I have to coordinate left pinky with right fingers. I'd rather not if I have a choice. In measure 11, you have to be very familiar and comfortable with the right D sharp to the left C. And it's worth it to you to have that smoothed out and practiced. So that it is as smooth as you can make it. I mean, the judges don't want to know that you have something tricky to do there. Neither does the audience, the judges. In measure 13, I absolutely am going to use the F sharp alternates for the first 2 F sharps in the measure. Okay. In the next beat, I am absolutely going to use the regular F sharp. There's no reason to use the alternate. And there's a hidden problem here in the leap from the last F sharp alternate, which is the 5th note, to the C sharp, which is the 6th note. You might get a hesitation there. That was pretty good. It's not just about your fingers arriving on the C sharp. It's also about your fingers having left, this finger having left these levers, and these levers are having a chance to close completely as you finger the C sharp. If you hear a hesitation there, it could be because your finger hasn't finished letting these levers go. Right? Yeah, and then otherwise it's largely pretty straightforward, and you just have to make what fingering choices make sense to you. Okay? I think the last thing that I would suggest to anybody who's working on these pieces, whether it's the bass clarinet one or the soprano clarinet one or any of them, is that our composer, Mr. Wall, has frequently chooses different words to slow down, and they mean something. So the 3 most common words we have in music to slow down are rallentando, ritardando, and ritenuto. Of the 3, rallentando is the mildest. It means just a little bit of slowdown. Ritardando means slow down. And ritenuto means slow down now, immediately. He doesn't use ritenuto, but for the ending of the piece, he uses molto ritardando. So that needs to be much more pronounced than the 2 previous rallentandos in measure 16 and in measure 29. By the way, a real quick comment about measure 16. Mr. Wall consistently writes his rallentando, ritardandos above the notes. That's a little unusual. In most editions, you'd see it beneath the notes. And it's important to realize that the rallentando and a tempo in 16 and 17 belong to 16 and 17 and not to 11 and 12. Okay, because it's kind of printed pretty high. So, last trick here for your molto ritardando at the end, or any of the other ones. Subdivision is a really great tool for making these ritardandi, or if you had an accelerandi, to making them sound really nice and organic. So, for example, measure 29. If you keep that, tongue it, like, so that it can be a real concrete thing as you develop the rallentando. But obviously you need to think it in your head as you perform it. And at the end, we have a molto ritardando. Sorry, excuse me. And I deliberately stopped the last note on the last quarter because it has a staccato, but it also has a tenuto. So there's one other place where we have this in the piece. It's the end of measure 8. And that's like It's like a long staccato or a separated legato. You can think of it as détaché. It's not. It's. Obviously different than the beginning, in which we have, or in which I would approach this as fully legato. So, I hope you find this useful. Good luck in your preparation, and I hope you have a wonderful audition for Allstate this year.